Hello, and thanks for stopping by. Although people in Britain were, quite rightly, noted for their resilience during the Second World War, it must be remembered that there were still certain ne'er-do-wells who thought nothing of exploiting the wartime conditions to suit their own nefarious ends. Racketeering, for example, was commonplace, and the looting of homes and businesses, which had been left unoccupied as their owners sought refuge from the nightly air raids, wasn't unknown either. There were a number of much higher profile crimes too, with one of the most notorious cases involving a foolish, yet ultimately very dangerous pair of lovers named Karl Hulten and Elizabeth Jones. This is their murderous tale.
Well, England, here I am. Well, this looks like an interesting corner. Hiya, babe. What you doing tonight?
From 1942 onwards, some 2 million American service personnel passed through Britain, and by the time this military activity reached its peak in 1944, the sight of US troops would have been commonplace in and around London. Few people therefore would have paid much attention to one particular olive green army truck as it rumbled around the streets of West London, little knowing that the young American driving it, Private Karl Hulten, was in fact an army deserter hiding in plain sight. Born in the Swedish capital Stockholm in 1922, Karl's parents had separated when he was just a few months old, and soon after, he and his mother emigrated to the United States, settling in Cambridge, Massachusetts. As a youngster, Karl was as good as gold. He did well at school, volunteered for the Salvation Army, and when he reached working age, he trained as a mechanic before gaining employment as a truck driver. He also married a woman named Rita, with whom he had a baby. As his mother would later insist, Karl was always a good boy before this awful war began. After America entered the war in December 1941, Karl joined the military, becoming a paratrooper with the 101st Airborne Division, and he was eventually posted to England, finding himself stationed at a camp in Newbury, Berkshire. Although army discipline kept most men in check, it seemed to have the opposite effect on Private Hulten, for he developed a rebellious streak, and often found himself in trouble with the military police. In the late summer of 1944, Karl heard rumours that he would soon be off to join the heat of the action in France, and it was at this point he decided the war was now getting just a little too close for comfort. It was time to get out of Dodge, and so he did just that, in some style it must be said, by stealing a lieutenant's jacket, a Remington pistol, and, most audaciously, a 2.5-ton US Army truck which had been left unattended outside Reading railway station. By early October 1944, Karl Hulten had been AWOL for 6 weeks, riding through London, sleeping in his purloined truck, and supporting himself through petty crime. One thing that wasn't a problem was fuel. Thanks to his lieutenant's jacket, he was able to roll up to any base for a top-up, although how he wasn't apprehended during such visits is anyone's guess. Despite his fugitive status, Karl still had a number of buddies in and around London, one of whom was a spiv-like fellow named Len Bexley, who also happened to be friends with a woman named Elizabeth Jones, an 18-year-old whose background was very different to Karl's, for her life up until that point had been very tough indeed. Elizabeth was born in Neath, South Wales in 1926. As an adolescent, she was considered something of a tearaway, and following numerous attempts to run away from home, Elizabeth was hauled to a juvenile court, where her parents stated that their daughter was beyond their control. Consequently, it was decided that Elizabeth, then aged 13, should be sent to an approved school, a type of boarding establishment where discipline was strictly enforced. At the tender age of 16, Elizabeth married a soldier named Stanley Jones, although unfortunately, this pairing was no honeymoon, as just hours after the ceremony, Stanley hit Elizabeth, prompting her, understandably, to walk out on him on their wedding night. Soon after, in January 1943, Elizabeth moved to London with ambitions of forging a new life as a dancer. She found accommodation on King Street in Hammersmith, but, like so many young people who harbour glamorous dreams, her situation required settling for a series of more realistic jobs, which included working as a waitress and a cinema usherette. She didn't completely give up on her dreams though, and in a naive attempt to make roads into showbiz, Elizabeth, using the stage name Georgina Grayson, fell into the seedy world of London's strip joints, many of which were clustered close to Piccadilly Circus. Even this line of work soon fizzled out though, when Elizabeth was booed off stage in the middle of a burlesque act, and by the autumn of 1944, her only income came from the small army allowance that she was entitled to through a doomed marriage to Stanley, who himself was now classed as missing in action following his involvement at the Battle of Arnhem. On the afternoon of Tuesday the 3rd of October 1944, Elizabeth was enjoying a cup of tea with Lem Bexley in the Black and White Cafe, which was on Hammersmith's Queen Caroline Street, when in strode Karl Hulten, who was known to his friends as Ricky. Len introduced the pair to each other, and they hit it off immediately. As they chatted over a cup of tea, Karl and Elizabeth arranged to meet up later that evening, outside the now lost Broadway Cinema, which, like the Black and White Cafe, was also located on Queen Caroline Street. When the time came, Karl pulled up outside the cinema in his trusty truck, and Elizabeth, keen to experience a drive in it, eagerly clambered aboard. As they motored along, Karl decided to come clean, admitting that he was a fugitive and that the lorry was ill-gotten, as was the Remington pistol, which he happily flashed about. Far from being shocked, these revelations apparently encouraged Elizabeth's devious side, leading her to say that she'd always fancied the idea of doing something dangerous, and that the thought of being a gun mole, the glamorous kind of femme fatale she'd seen in so many American gangster movies, excited her.
I did it because I love you.
Love. That's a good one.
I thought she was just kidding, Karl would later say, but she said she was serious. Despite coming clean about his desertion, Karl now decided to indulge Elizabeth's fantasy by telling her that, back in America, he was a noted Chicago wise guy, a gunman as he put it, as well as claiming that he was now running a gang in London. This was all pure nonsense of course, but as they drove west out of the capital, Elizabeth seemed to buy it. After leaving London, Karl and Elizabeth headed towards Reading, and as the lorry bounced along a dark country road, they spotted a nurse riding a bicycle. Karl felt the time had now come to prove he was a tough guy, and so, after passing the cyclist, he pulled up a short distance away, hopped out the cab, and waited for the woman to trundle past. When she did, he shoved her, knocking her off the bike. Not exactly Al Capone levels of crime, but still a downright wicked thing to do. Fortunately, the nurse was uninjured, although she fled in panic, leaving her bike and purse, which Karl took, behind. Although the proceeds from this pathetic, yet vile crime earned the pair just a few shillings and a handful of clothing coupons, they seemed to revel in the experience, and after dropping Elizabeth back at her King Street flat at around 5 AM, they arranged to meet again the following afternoon. Karl and Elizabeth's second date was more conventional at first, starting with dinner, followed by a film at the Gaumont Cinema, which is now the famous Hammersmith Apollo, where they sat arm in arm in the dark. However, after exiting the cinema at around 9 PM, their thoughts turned devious, and they once again climbed into the lorry and headed west, this time with ambitions of robbing a pub somewhere near Sonning, which is a village situated on the Thames close to Reading. For reasons unknown, although it was probably because, deep down, they both knew it was a damn stupid idea, they called off this caper, leading Karl to spin the truck around and head back towards London, eventually ending up at Marble Arch. Here, Elizabeth suggested a taxi would make a more suitable target for robbery, and being such a busy junction, it didn't take the pair long to pinpoint one. They began following the cab, tailing it as it headed north along Edgware Road and up through Maida Vale and Kilburn. At Cricklewood, Karl decided to make his move, and once the taxi had come to a halt, he got out and approached the driver, his gun at the ready. It was only then that he said that the passenger on board was an American officer, and a burly looking one at that. Needless to say, Karl lost his cool and hot-footed it back to the lorry. This incident likely injured Karl's ego, and so, as they headed back south along Edgware Road, he was no doubt delighted when he spotted a far easier mark: a young woman struggling to drag 2 suitcases along the pavement. This was 19-year-old Violet Hodge, and she was making her way to Paddington Station, from where she intended to catch a train home to Bristol. Karl offered Violet a lift, telling her he could take her as far as Reading Station, which, being somewhat further along the line, would save her part of the fare. Violet agreed, and the group drove for some time, but then, close to Runnymede Park, Karl faked a flat tyre. As the trio climbed out of the vehicle to inspect the wheel and have a cigarette, Karl picked up a tyre wrench, but it wasn't for loosening wheel nuts. Instead, he used it to crack Violet around the head, before proceeding to half strangle her. As Violet lay stunned, Karl and Elizabeth searched her pockets, finding just 5 shillings. Although for Elizabeth, it was the 2 suitcases which proved to be the real bounty, as they were packed with clothes. The pair then dumped Violet's unconscious body in a ditch, leaving her for dead, although fortunately she survived the ordeal. It had been a busy night, and after once again dropping Elizabeth off at King Street in the early hours, they agreed to meet again later that evening. On the 6th of October, Karl and Elizabeth rendezvoused at 11 PM, and this time they decided to get straight down to business, agreeing to have another go at robbing a taxi driver. For this sting, they decided it would be better to flag a cab down rather than chase one, and so they stood on Hammersmith Road, waiting to stick their arms out. A car soon spotted them, but it wasn't a London taxi. It was a private vehicle, a Ford V8, driven by 34-year-old George Heath. Until recently, George had been in the army. He was a veteran of Dunkirk no less, but following a war injury, he'd been discharged. He lived on Kennington Park Road and had 2 sons. Although he wasn't a licensed cabbie, George made the fateful decision that night to offer Karl and Elizabeth a lift. After climbing into the V8, Karl directed George along Great Western Road, carefully slipping his pistol from his belt as they drove. Then, on a quiet patch near Chiswick Roundabout, he asked George to pull over. As soon as the car came to a halt, Karl quickly aimed his pistol and fired, shooting George in the back. He then shoved his slumped, but still breathing victim into the passenger seat, slid behind the wheel and started driving. As they sped through the night, Elizabeth rifled through George's pockets. George was a regular at the racetrack, and that night he happened to have £8 on him, which is roughly £250 in today's money, which Elizabeth pocketed, along with his watch and cigarette case. George had other items on him too, namely a checkbook, various bits of paperwork and some family photos, but such trinkets were deemed worthless by Elizabeth, and she chucked them out the window. It took George Heath 15 minutes to die, after which his killers drove to Knoll Green, near Staines railway station, where they unceremoniously dumped his body. The following day was a Saturday, and after selling George's watch for £5, Karl and Elizabeth used their ill-gotten gains to spend the day drinking at various pubs, and betting on the Greyhounds at White City Stadium's dog track, which was located on the corner of Wood Lane and the Westway. To get around, they used George's Ford V8 car, and at some point that day, Elizabeth decided that she needed a fur coat to combat the autumn chill, and what better way to obtain such a garment than to steal one. In search of this item, the couple drove down to swanky Knightsbridge, where they spotted an elderly woman wearing such a coat outside the Berkeley Hotel. When Karl made a grab for his prize, however, this brave lady fought back, and as he noticed a police constable wasn't too far away, he beat a hasty retreat. The pair stayed out until the early hours of Sunday morning, and after driving back to Hammersmith, Karl parked the Ford beside an air raid shelter on a quiet road called Lurgan Avenue, which is located close to Fulham Palace Road. As all of this was going on, George's body had been discovered, and thanks to the items Elizabeth had hurled out the window, police quickly ascertained that the murder victim had owned a car, registration RD8895. These details were circulated, and early on the evening of Sunday the 8th of October, a patrolling bobby spotted the car parked at its secluded spot. After alerting Hammersmith Police Station, the constable was joined by an inspector in a patrol car, who had an inkling the culprit would eventually come back to retrieve the vehicle, and so they staked it out. Sure enough, at 9 PM, Karl Hulten turned up and was promptly arrested. He gave a false name, Second Lieutenant Richard Allen, and was found to have the murder weapon on him, along with a magazine of bullets. During World War II, the Visiting Forces Act stated that any American serviceman suspected of a crime was to be dealt with by the American authorities, and so Karl was taken to the US Army's military police headquarters, which was located at Piccadilly Circus. It was also the policy of the US Army to keep records of every recruit's fingerprints, which made it easy to link Karl to the Ford V8, and under questioning, he wasted no time in implicating Elizabeth. As a matter of fact, Elizabeth was already under suspicion, as a friend of hers had contacted the police to say the troubled young woman had been dropping alarming hints about a supposed murder. When she was arrested at King Street, Elizabeth was found to be wearing Violet Hodges' coat, and items of clothing, which he'd stolen from the 2 suitcases after the attack at Runnymede, were also found inside her flat. The Americans were disgusted with Karl Hulten, so much so that, in an unprecedented move, they waived the Visiting Forces Act so that he could be tried in an English court. The trial of Karl Hulten and Elizabeth Jones commenced at the Old Bailey on the 16th of January 1945, and due to the concept of a joint enterprise, both were accused of murder. The case, which the press had dubbed the Cleft Chin Murder due to George Heath's distinctive facial feature, caused a sensation, and there was so much demand for a seat in a public gallery that tickets had to be issued, some of which, it was reported, were offered by touts for up to £5, which was a lot of money in those days. The trial also marked the very first time that a reporter from the BBC was inside the Central Criminal Court to cover the story. During the proceedings, Karl and Elizabeth essentially blamed each other. Elizabeth, who spoke in barely a whisper, claimed that she'd been lied to and had grown terrified of Karl. And Karl, dressed in his large army overcoat, said that Elizabeth had manipulated him. As for the killing of George Heath itself, Elizabeth stated that she'd been immediately appalled, supposedly declaring, "It's cold-blooded murder, how could he do it?" To which Karl, according to her, stated, "People in my profession haven't time to think what they do." In Karl's version of events, he said he intended to fire a warning shot at the car's door, but when George suddenly turned around, the gun went off accidentally. The trial lasted 6 days, and it took the jury just 1 hour and 15 minutes to find both Karl and Elizabeth guilty of murder, the penalty for which was death. As the judge, Mr. Justice Charles, donned his black cap to pass his grim sentence on the two, Karl remained impassive, whilst Elizabeth, who was still only 18, became hysterical, and as she was led back down to the cells, she could be heard screaming, "The brute! Why didn't he tell the truth?" Over the next few weeks, the pair appealed their sentences, Elizabeth doing so from Holloway Prison, and Karl from Wormwood Scrubs, from where he also wrote a letter to his mother back in Massachusetts, in which he claimed he wished he could, quote, "start life all over again." "Everybody makes a mistake in their lives," he continued. "This one was mine, but it'll be the last mistake I make, if I get out of this." Karl Hulten's mistake did indeed prove to be his last, for his appeal failed, and he was transferred to Pentonville Prison, where, on the 8th of March 1945, just a few days after his 23rd birthday, he was executed by the renowned hangman Albert Pierpoint. Elizabeth fared better. Her appeal succeeded, and she was spared just 30 hours before she was due to go to the gallows, her sentence being commuted to life. She remained incarcerated at Aylesbury Prison for the next 9 years, and was released in 1954, after which she sold her story to the newspapers. Beyond that, little was known of Elizabeth Jones's life, although it's believed she died in 1980, which, if true, would mean she would have been aged just 54. Just months after George Heath's murder, a showman from Bristol named Harry Horlock purchased a murder car, which still sported the bullet hole, and displayed it in a tasteless travelling show where punters could pay 6pence to sit inside. The person shown sitting here in it is none other than Violet Hodge, the woman who was left for dead at Runnymede. The story of London's Bonnie and Clyde has been loosely dramatised several times over the ensuing years, namely in two films, 1948's Good Time Girl and 1990's Chicago Joe and the Showgirl, which starred Kiefer Sutherland and Emily Lloyd. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you found this look at London's Bonnie and Clyde interesting. Was it a case you were familiar with? Do you think the sentences were justified? And would you like me to cover more of London's true crime tales? Please be sure to let me know your thoughts in the comments. As always, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of you who left such kind comments recently. And if you're a new subscriber, welcome. It's great to have you here. If you haven't yet subscribed, I'd appreciate it very much if you could please consider doing so, because this, along with clicking the bell icon to receive notifications, will ensure that you don't miss out whenever I publish any future content. Likes and shares are also very welcome, as they really do help the channel to grow. If you're feeling extra generous, you can also support my work with a tip via either my Ko-fi account, the link for which I'll provide below, or the YouTube thanks button, which appears as a heart icon below the video. Any such donations are of course very greatly appreciated. If you're interested in merchandise, I have an Etsy store too, Rob's Online Designs, where you can purchase an array of London themed mugs, featuring hand illustrated designs of taxis, tube trains, buses and so on. Links in the description. For now, thanks again friends, stay well and please be sure to stay tuned.